Welcome to the life and secret teachings of Jesus the Christ. It was in 1970 that Jesus appeared to me for the first time. This was to change my life drastically and send me on that long search to find the missing pieces that are not commonly written about. I wondered where he had been between 3 and 12 and where he'd been between 12 and 30. This was to cover some of the greatest libraries of the world. Finally, after 20 years, the pieces of the giant puzzle have been put together. Please join me on this very exciting journey. Welcome to another episode of Mystic Christianity. When we left off last week, we were talking about the resurrection of the dead. That most people, at least 1 billion Christians, believe that the resurrection of the dead is something that's going to take place in the future, maybe after they're no longer in embodiment. And that if they've been saved, then they don't have to face the resurrection of the dead. The graves, Gabriel would blow his horn and the graves would open, the skeletons would get out and the souls would jump into the skeletons. They say bodies, but you see all that's left, of course, is a skeleton. And we could see this picture that takes place in the dark ages of Christianity, where all these long lines of skeletons would be waiting for the time of the terrible judgment. We also discussed last week that with modern age where we can read and write, we are fully cognizant that the resurrection of the dead has to mean something else, that it is in reality the resurrection of the divine nature in us. If we can go back to, again, kind of referring to what we covered in our last episode, the fact that after 325 AD, when the bishops became guardian of the mysteries, and we're talking about the Christian mysteries, they were no longer given to the mass consciousness. From that time on, for most part, the teachings were literal or exoteric, outer. If we take literally St. John's dragons of the apocalypse, we would come to an awareness that no such creatures ever lived upon earth. They not only never lived upon earth, but there is nothing to indicate that there will ever be creatures like this on earth in tomorrow's world. So we realize that these creatures of St. John's were what were called an anthropos. An anthropos being a figure that represents something else. For instance, probably one of Christianity's greatest anthropos is the concept of Satan. And we will try to look at that just a little later, because in the old days, Satan was really called the devil. And he wore a red suit of underwear, and he had cloven hooves, and he breathed fire, and he had a couple of horns, and he had a pitchfork, or a pitchfork, and also his long tail was long. And we come to understand this as a deity in ancient times, and then gradually it evolved into a power. We're going to prove to you that Satan and the devil are anthropos, representing our own lower natures, and not a deity or force that is outside of ourselves or outside of humanity. But before we do this, since in that is all constitutes a part of the great mysteries of the resurrection, and that the resurrection became the most guarded secret of the Christian world. So for this reason, we have decided to focus these weeks upon first the life and secret teachings of Jesus, and then the last part of the great work will be focused only upon the resurrection of the dead. That we would be giving you the techniques which Jesus gave to his disciples on the shores of Galilee, a way and a method by which you too could pass through and enter the resurrection. If I can go to the board and just reiterate briefly what we covered and where we left off last week. We talked about the fact that there was mass consciousness people who are good, because people are basically good. Oh yes, we know there are bad people in the world, people who violate natural and cosmic law because they don't know the penalties involved by their disobedience to this. But, so mass consciousness is basically good. And from mass consciousness we went into what we called a devotee, devoted to a singular master. We saw the devotee in the form of certainly those that carry their Bible and go out from door to door and try to catch you on the streets and convert you. And that this was not bad, that these were people who felt they had more to offer and were putting more initiative in the outside world than those of mass consciousness. But that devotee and accepting Jesus as the Savior was in reality a form of rebirth, but not the rebirth that is really spoken of in the Scriptures. The rebirth in the Scriptures is that of the resurrection. And that after the devotee, there came another doorway, people who questioned how, since there were never creatures with long hair and bear's paws and human faces with lion's teeth and all of this, what did they mean? Where did we come from? Why was mankind, who is very beautiful in reality, why was mankind decreed a sinner? So these people step out of even the devotee stage to come to approach deeper mysteries, a deeper realization and interpretation of the Scriptures than they may have had before. And we called these, if you remember last week, probationers. And that this very large doorway here was in reality the narrow gate by which many are called and few are chosen. That it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it was for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And the gate is, few are those who find the gateway. That this gateway pertained to rebirth and resurrection. That the Spirit, which is the guardian of the soul, through the devotion of mankind in meditation and in study and wanting to see and to know God. And particularly therein lies the key, because Jesus left 2 commandments. The first, love God and love each other. He must have had a reason for saying that our first love should be God. And in my own life, as I turn toward the understanding and communion with God, was when the doorways open to the great mystical teachings. Here we said that we are tested to be found if we are worthy. This doesn't mean that every man, woman, and child will not be worthy someday. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about whether the soul is really ready for the Via Dolorosa, which is the resurrection of the dead. No master, including Jesus and God, are going to take upon themselves someone who is neither hot nor cold. They're going to look for those people who are dedicated to the path of truth. Here is a little bit of balancing. The war with Lucifer has always been the war between personal and impersonal life. We come to think of impersonal as not caring. That's our common interpretation of it. But the impersonal life in the Christian mysteries means to develop an unconditional love, where we can love everyone's children as much as our own, as much as Jesus loved everyone's children, as much as he loved everyone's mother and father and sisters and brothers, that we would find in our hearts the ability to love everyone in the world as God and the Master did. So for this reason, personal versus impersonal is the ability to expand our love, our power, our wisdom beyond the confines of those that are nice to us, beyond the confines of those that our family and relatives, because these are in some ways easy to love. They are, after all, our family. But to love the world as our family, that is more difficult. But Jesus loved the world as his family, and God loves the world as his family. So from this standpoint, the first test is personal versus impersonal. The second part of this is a series of experiences, because we mentioned that these represented the first 2 stages of the Via Dolorosa, the 14 stations of the cross. So as a result, on this second station here then, Jesus was scourged or whipped. So there are a series of things, obstacles, and tests that are put in front of us to once again cause us to seek inside of ourselves and see if we are really ready for the type of dedication that it requires for the resurrection. If we are found, and I think I better make this just a little bit smaller so that I have room enough to draw. If the person wants to find God more than anything else in the world, if that is the most important thing, and they want to walk as Jesus did, in universality, love for their fellow man, to heal the sick and the poor, to dedicate their lives to the service of God, then the Spirit descends to live in the flesh. This is the Spirit of light. In Christianity, we have referred to this as the Christ light. In Hinduism, it is known as the light of Krishna. In Buddhahood, or Buddhism, it is known as Buddhahood. So as the Spirit, which has always been like a little diamond, a star in the soul, is raised from the dead, because raising from the dead means that this part of us which is divine has been immersed into that part which is corporeal or mortal. So through our meditation, our love, devotion, we raise this divine spark, like this. It raises up and becomes united with the Spirit of God, brings back to the soul and the corporeal world not only the consciousness of God, but also the knowledge and wisdom of God and the guidance which will transform the soul from its human and corporeal senses to the world of divine and angelic. And that the second part of the possession is always the descent of the crown. As they plaited a crown of thorns and put on Jesus' head, there must be a way and means by which the Spirit can govern, direct, train, and guide. Thus the crown of thorns comes on the head. We normally call those the bands. And that represents the next 2 stations of the cross. They put upon Jesus a scarlet robe, the descent of the Spirit. And they plaited a crown of thorns. And we said, insofar as the other 10 stations of the cross, we'll be taking those up later in the last 16 episodes as we go through the actual knowledge and understanding of the resurrection. But in the meantime now, today, we want to continue on where we left off last week. I want to go through some of the books that you saw stacked up here last week and that are here again. This represents only a fragment of the over 100 books that pertain to Jesus, his teachings and his life, and some of them to the secret teachings. This book right here is probably our most important find. This is a part of the manuscript that was translated by Professor Edmond Bordeaux-Zeke during his studies in the Roman Vatican. This is called, of course, the Gospel of Peace of Jesus the Christ according to John. And if you remember, John wrote Revelation, the Acts of John, which is in the Apocrypha New Testament, and then we have the Gospel of John, and we have again, the Gospel of Peace. The Gospel of Peace was one of those manuscripts that was, and still is, contained in the Roman Vatican. Professor Zeke, who spoke 15 languages, was a young man, and because of his, I'm not going to say influence, but his ability to speak so many languages, at the age of 18, he was given special permission to go and study in the Roman Vatican, in the secret archives. It was not long after his studies or after his arrival there, when he was sitting with a very large group of books and researching St. Francis of Assisi, who was one of his great favorites. And he wondered where St. Francis's teachings came from. Monsignor Macati, who was prefect of the archives at that particular time, came up and said that Professor Zeke, then called Edmund, needed to hunt the river and the stream and the source if he were to really know the source of the teachings of St. Francis of Assisi. This took Professor Zeke through a couple of other studies that St. Francis had been affiliated with, and until at last he found the river, a manuscript in the secret archives of the Vatican called the Gospel, or the Unknown Gospel of John. Professor had concern whether to translate this from Aramaic and Hebrew and bring it to the open world. However, the prefect of the archive said, "Let St. Francis sing in your heart," meaning follow what your heart bids you to do. So thanks to Professor's work, we now have in the Western world the translation of Jesus' most secret teachings. The Gospel of Peace, the first part of it, pertains to Jesus' teachings on health and nutrition. And of course, we never thought of Jesus teaching health and nutrition. But if you think of Leviticus, then you will realize that food and health has symbolized a part of religious traditions. After the part on nutrition, Jesus goes into communion with the angels. When he talked about communion with the angels, he wasn't talking about winged creatures who may be on the other side. Yes, we have angels, those who do not have to wear embodiment, that are members of the angelic kingdom and the archangelic, and certainly the Godhead itself. But he spoke of angels, or communions with the angels, as the powerful forces of heaven and earth. In other words, to try to train mankind, or humankind, who could not read or write, because most of them in Jesus' time were illiterate. To try to train them to understand the utilization of forces would have been impossible. And I'm not even sure that these were taught to the masses, but there are indications as we read through this that he taught many people. But they could understand the term angels. It's easy for us to think in terms of an angel sitting in the middle of a sun, that we can commune with that angel of the sun. That it is for us to come to the realization that the sun is a mindless consciousness, and yet an intelligent consciousness that contains the prototype or engineering plan of a solar system. For us to try to commune with such a powerful force as the sun is very difficult, and certainly it would have been 2,000 years ago. So he taught the angel of water, the angel of sunlight, the angel of earth, and the angel that touched all the crops and turned them from the green growing wheat grass into the golden grain of maturity. Those were the forces of the earthly mother. He then taught the forces of the Heavenly Father, was communion with power, so that we could enhance this power that is in us, be more creative. How to commune with the angel of wisdom, or that powerful aspect of wisdom that flows through our 150 billion galaxies and that we're a part of. That's almost too mind-boggling for us even today. So to think that there was an angel who represented God, who was the key to all wisdom, was therefore much easier. So communion with the angels. And then from the communions of the angels, he taught a sevenfold path of peace, which to me is exquisite because it teaches us how to be at peace with our body, peace with the mind, peace with the family, Jesus on peace with humanity, peace with culture, peace with the earthly mother and the heavenly Father. And after all this was done, came probably the greatest. And actually the greatest was not published until after Professor died. It had been his policy to follow the path of old, that people would first purify their body, and so he taught that for many years. Then they would come into communion with the angels, and he released that shortly after I met him, probably in about 1975 or 1976. But the part that was to pertain to the merger of the holy streams, that was not to be given to mankind until after his death. His wife tells me that the devastation of Professor's death had her in such sorrow that the first thing she did is go right straight to his briefcase and pull out the transformation, or rather the translation, of the merger with the holy streams. And we're going to cover all of this because in here is the secret to the resurrection. Not just to knowing and learning what the resurrection is, we've already looked at that to some degree, but how to do it, how to pass through the resurrection. So we'll be coming back to this as time passes. Some of the other books that I have here are interesting books. We have here, again, one of those manuscripts that I really couldn't afford to buy in manuscript form, and you can tell this one is really beaten up. But this was called The Letter. It's a translation of a letter that was written by one Essene to another Essene 7 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, who was at the time an eyewitness of Jesus during the crucifixion. Apparently, the Essenes had heard rumors that Jesus was one of them. They had heard of the crucifixion. They wrote to their members in Jerusalem to find out if indeed Jesus had been part of the Essenes. Not necessarily at the time that he died, but if he had ever been affiliated with them. This is a translation of the letter that Essene wrote back, which tells us, gives us, for instance, virtually a translation of the death warrant of Jesus the Christ, as well as some of the things that we didn't know about before. We'll be taking a look at this, not too much. The manuscript has some flaws in the sense that it is been translated, I think, several times, and like most things, including our Bible, it gets watered down with each translation. Now, I'm not making fun of the Bible. The Bible has been a tool which has guided man for centuries. And prior to the time we had the Bible, there was such things as the Quran, the teachings of Moses that existed to guide his people. So it does lead us on a better path. But the point is, we are still dealing with a hidden teaching, esoteric, and an exoteric or outer teaching. So we are not getting the fullness, nor are we getting it complete. As I mentioned last week, if the Bible were complete, you would be unable to lift it, nor to read it in a lifetime. That originally there were over 300 books that the Roman Vatican, at that time, I'm not going to say the Vatican, but the bishops looked at very closely to see if we would have what we would have in our Bible and what would be taken away. And so those scriptures pertaining mostly to Jesus and his resurrection have been the most important context of the scriptures for us. But then we got curious as we got educated. We began to wonder where Jesus was during the lost years. Why shouldn't we wonder about it? Surely if he was written about from the age of 30 to 33, which was his primary mission in Jerusalem or in Israel, if we have these writings that tell us about his birth and about going to Egypt, then somewhere, someplace, he must have been written about in other ways and other times. And that's true. But for some reason, Christianity has chosen to absolutely discard the Apocrypha New Testament simply because it's not a part of the fundamental and traditional scriptures. I sometimes think that closed-mindedness is probably more dangerous than the hydrogen bomb, because we can only fill those blank places of Jesus' life if we're willing to go on the long search for his life. The Apocrypha opens up a wealth of speculation, like the book of James, which was Jesus' older brother, which tells us the name of Jesus' grandmother and his grandfather. Surely we do not think that Mary doesn't have a mother who would be Jesus' grandmother. Surely we cannot possibly believe that he remained in the carpenter world from the age of 3 to the age of 30. There's not a thing in traditional scripture that indicates it. So we go on to assumptions, simply because his father was a carpenter, but his father was also something else. His father belonged to the aristocracy of Israel. He was a descendant of King David ben Jesse. Jesus' mother was a descendant of King David ben Jesse, both from the tribe of Judah. Joseph was also a member of the Sanhedrin Council, the Supreme Court of Israel. I remember when I was writing the book, The Harp of Destiny, on Jesus' life, that a voice spoke to me and said, Joseph was a member of the Grand Council. And I said, I will never be able to prove that to humanity. The next day, I picked up this book and it fell open and it said, Joseph, why were you not in council yesterday? And he said, because the trip had been long from Nazareth and they were very tired, and he felt that it was best to rest before he came to council. It's in here. But the most important to me is the Acts of John, which was the closest disciple to Jesus and the one that wrote the most accurate description. In other words, the Gospel of John is much more accurate than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I will show you soon that John, the beloved, was Jesus' cousin, as was John the Baptist. So I like the Acts of John. But the book of James fills in so many of the missing pieces. This particular apocryphal New Testament was done by Dr. Montague Rhodes James, who was provost at Eton University, and is put out by the Oxford University Press, and that, of course, that particular division was in England. These two books here are nothing more than the same thing by, I'm going to kind of stumble as I pronounce the name probably, but Henneke and Schlemmer, New Testament Apocryphal. The thing that that perhaps this little one has over this is that it contains the letter of Lentulus, who wrote to the Roman officials. Apparently, the Roman officials had heard of Jesus' miracles, so they wrote to Lentulus to inquire about this. And Lentulus answers the Roman officials about Jesus, and as a result of this, he gives a physical description of Jesus and solves once and for all what Jesus really looked like, or as close as we can get without having a photograph on his driver's license or certainly his passport. But this is the New Testament Apocryphal, and something else is kind of interesting about the Apocryphal New Testaments. There was a period of time in which apocalypses became quite fashionable. John the Beloved was not the only one to write an apocalypse. We have back here, certainly the apocalypse of Paul and the apocalypse of Peter. We have the apocalypse of Thomas and, of course, the vision of, let me see who else, Stephen, I think it was, had not necessarily an apocalypse, but he did have a vision. It's just talking here about some of the apocalyptic prophecies. This one says Paul, Thomas, the other is Solomon, so maybe I can tell better from books that are less clumsy. I'll have to put some of these on the floor in a moment, because here it is, the revelation of Stephen, which comes right prior to the Acts of Paul. This one also has the apocalypse of Paul in it, the apocalypse of Peter, and of course and we have the apocalypse of John, of course, in traditional scripture. So just a moment, and I will be stooping down and disposing of some of these books here so that they're not quite so heavy. There we are. Thank you for your patience. This was written by Bashara Shahadi. It's the Confessions of Pontius Pilate. And Fabricius Albanus was a playmate of Pilate, and this was translated into Arabic and later translated from Arabic into English, talking about how Pontius Pilate felt after the crucifixion. Most of you know that he took his own life because he could not stand the thing that he had done. This book here is called Hebraic Tongue Restored. It's put out by Samuel Weiser. This was written by Fabre d'Olivet. We talked last week about some of the great immortals, people in our own time and places that had passed through this resurrection of the dead, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Leonardo da Vinci, Beethoven, Einstein, Jacques Cousteau. This was another one of the great illumined men, meaning one who was Christed. Fabre d'Olivet, probably the greatest, or one of the finest of Hebrew scholars. It was Fabre d'Olivet that broke the code of Moses. And Fabre d'Olivet came to understand that Moses contained in his secret teachings used proper names, but those proper names symbolized something else. Like there wasn't any Adam and Eve, a man and woman, to be the first man and woman on earth, but rather Adam, the intellect or the intelligence of the soul and its descent into matter, gathered around it a suit of clothes and walked as darkness or Eve. So thus it was that the soul, having been submerged encompassed the soul, causing it to walk in darkness and ignorance and unknowingness. We can't say that this was a malicious or a cruel trick. It was simply that here we were, undeveloped light, pure essence. But on the other hand, as we descended in the world of matter, we needed to build a planet, because how can we help human life if we ourselves have not been human? And so we might look at human evolution and progression as simply a cycle of necessity. So Fabre d'Olivet, in breaking Moses' code, we can take a look at the beauty of it, because on the, for instance, it said that, like on the seventh day, instead of the simplicity of on the seventh day God rested, and he fulfilled, he the gods in the light manifestation of the seventh, the sovereign work, and he restored himself in the light manifestation of the seventh from the whole sovereign work which he had performed. So we know that somehow there is yet another epoch, another era of progression. In other words, when human, who is in the sixth epoch, becomes divine, and in which they will no longer need human embodiment, then God will have restored the world to, shall we say, much more than what it was in the beginning, but to its divine estate. I think that would be the best way. Fabre de Vallave speaks of Adam. He said, and he formed Awa, he the being of beings, the self-sameness of Adam, collective man. By rarefying the Adamic ground, or the ground, by rarefying it means by the light descending to live in the world of matter. This is known in Christianity often as the fall of Lucifer. In mystic Christianity, the fall of Lucifer defines the descent of the soul to live in the world of matter, in which partaking then, having independent individualization, it partook of the tree of knowledge. In other words, it then had a choice whether to go the path of darkness or light. It would be that way for centuries and generations as the newborn soul grew and developed and mastered its earth, so that the light would prevail over all of earth. Then human evolution would be finished. So Adam and Eve merely represents the soul, the intelligence or intellect of collective man and its descent into the darkness and unknowingness of matter. There's a lot more than this, but he did break down the symbolism by proving that the proper names used in here were in reality meaning they meant something. Another book is The Drama of the Lost Disciples. Again, this is a book that doesn't look like it's much. It's in soft cover, but we never know what's underneath the cover till we open it. You see, there's much evidence in England, the Royal Library of England, as to the journey of the Holy Family to England after the crucifixion. This sums up much of the research, and then there was another one that was called I think was done by Lewis, who was a monk who lived in England, who collected a book called Joseph Arrhythmia de Glastonbury, which gathered all the evidence up that would pertain to the Holy Family's journey to England. It seemed that after the crucifixion and Joseph's arrest, that he was forced into exile, because he knew that his life would not be extended if he remained in Israel. Also the women, Martha and Lazarus and Mary Magdalene, Jesus' Aunt Mary, their lives also were greatly jeopardized. The men, or apostles who remained behind, such as John and Peter and some of those, felt that the women could not withstand the persecution that would be forthcoming. Took the women, and including Lazarus, to England shore. At first they landed in Gaul, which is now, of course, certainly France. They were met by a group of Druids who took them to England and introduced them to the Pendragon, who gave amnesty to the Christians and acres of land. It was there that the first Christian church was formed in England. And of course, there's always been a kind of an argument between England and Rome over who had the original church, because here was Joseph Arrhythmia, Mary and Martha all starting the Church of England. Over in Rome, of course, was Paul starting the church in Roman proper. Then the disciples were in Jerusalem. They also, particularly the 7 churches of Asia Minor, which were founded by John. So as a result of this, the church kind of sprung up over that part of the country very quickly. This has a lot of things that are very interesting in it, and certainly we know that the history of the Holy Family seemed to have dropped off after the crucifixion. Not so much so the apostles. We have the Acts of Paul and some of those that came afterwards. But to hear Mary and Martha and what happened to them, suddenly it was like it was the end of the world. And we know that someplace that had to be recorded. And primarily it was because they were not in Israel. and no one should ever try to ferret the Christian mysteries without a good Bible dictionary. My favorite is the New Unger's Bible Dictionary. I always, I don't know, seem to sense that maybe Dr. Unger felt that no one else had ever done a good Bible. So therefore he decided to do the dictionary himself. We needed to understand, for instance, subtle mysteries like why in Revelation should we deal with something like 2 measures of barley and 1 measure of wheat. Well, barley, of course, was that belonged to the poor. They could afford barley, but they could not afford wheat. So it meant that for every measure of bad that we'd done, we'd get issued 2 measures of barley. But wheat, which was considered almost like gold in a sense, and the higher, how would I classify it? We might call it the upper class, would therefore eat wheat. And it would mean then that 1 measure of wheat for every good that we had done. So without the Bible dictionary, we would not understand the difference between barley and wheat, and so we need this. Now as we come to the beginning of Jesus' life, and I rather think that's where I want to go and probably end up today, we are caught with the deep and profound mystery of who was Jesus. This is the great Jewish historian, and he wrote the Jewish War and the Antiquities. The shocking thing that I discovered was the fact that there were so many Jesuses, all approximately the same time, that I don't know how we ever got them straightened out. There was, of course, Jesus the Christ, a testimony to him, but that only takes up 1 paragraph in here. There was Jesus, the son of Phabet, who was deprived of the high priesthood. There was Jesus, the son of Ananus, and his ominous clamor and death. Jesus or Jason. There was Jesus, the son of Fabius, the governor of Tiberias. There was Jesus, the brother of Onias, deprived of the high priesthood by Antiochus. There was Jesus, the son of Gamaliel, made high priest, and that's a very special one to me because as we go through Jesus' life, we will find that Gamaliel was indeed one of Jesus' teachers. And so impressed was this teacher, and it was said when he died, not Jesus, but when Gamaliel died, that the law died with him. And he was so impressed with Jesus that he ultimately named his own son Jesus, and that Jesus became high priest of Jerusalem. There was Jesus, the eldest priest after Ananus, and his speech to the Enemeans. The speech is brilliant and certainly shows a degree of literacy that we might never have dreamed possible with any other Jesus other than Jesus the Christ. There was Jesus, the son of Damnius, who was made high priest, and there was Jesus, the son of Gamaliel. Jesus, or Joshua, the son of Nun, of course that is Old Testament. There was Jesus, the son of Saphat, who was a ringleader of the robbers. There was Jesus, the son of, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it, Thebuthus, I suppose, a priest. Jesus, the son of Josedek, who, then that's the end of the Jesuses. At the time that I was researching Jesus over 20 years ago. So intense was my research. I can remember sitting in a chair and actually feeling my brain kind of knot up like you get a Charlie horse or a knot in your leg. And I thought to myself, I'm going at this much too intently. Our brain is, after all, an instrument and is not the thinking part of us, and I am overworking it. So I tried to find a little moderation after that, but that's very hard to do because I joined those ranks of the people that wanted to know everything about Jesus, what he ate, what he what he taught, where he was during the lost years, his family, all the things that we don't hear a great deal about. So now I'm going to the board, and this is based upon This information is based upon the Gospel of James, which comes from the Apocryphal New Testament. The first is Anna and Joachim. These are Jesus' grandparents. The story about Anna and Joachim is a very beautiful one because Anna had been praying to God for a child. This had been denied her. And it was looked upon in Israel that if a woman could not bear a child, she was therefore cursed by God and virtually an outcast. Joachim was quite wealthy by the standards of the time, for he was a sheep herder, and he would give 1/3 of his holdings to the poor, 1/3 to the temple, and 1/3 he kept for his own household. They were going down to the Temple of Jerusalem on the Feast of the Dedication. We take our Christmas celebration to some sense from the Feast of the Dedication because in those days they lit candles and placed them in every window. We now take the Christmas tree and it is filled with lights, each light connected to another, representing the light of mankind. In the ancient Feast of the Dedication, it represented the Christ light, or equivalent to the Christ light, since Jesus wasn't yet born, but equivalent to the Christ light that was in all mankind, and that each person put it in their window at the time of the Feast of the Dedication as they rededicated their lives and followed the teachings of Moses. Our Christmas is something else, and before we are through, I promise you that we will go into the Christmas mysteries, because mystic Christianity is broken into two sets of mysteries. The first, the Christian or Christmas mysteries. The second, the Easter mysteries. And I do not know which is the beautiful. They're both delightful. But back to Anna and Joachim. He is taking his herds, to a third of his herd, to the Temple of Jerusalem at the Feast of the Dedication. They have started their pilgrimage with their tithing to the church. They are joined by others. They are wearing special garments that show a more festive mood, because that's the way they dressed for the festivals. Other people would join them, and it was also custom to carry the tribal standard. It turned out that as they approached the Temple of Jerusalem, that the gatekeeper looked at Joachim and said, "What right have you to bring your tithing to the church when you have not brought forth any children? Because God has cursed you." You can imagine what this would have done to Joachim in the presence of his fellow man, in the presence of the other tribes. And so he left and took his sheep and went into the mountains, swearing he would not come out until God answered his prayers, because he had been so greatly humiliated. Before going, he checked the records to see if he was indeed the only one who had not brought forth seed in Israel. And what he found didn't give him any consolation. Now Anna is not only barren, but her husband has left her because she cannot bear children. This is like a double calamity, because now she dons the garments of a widow. As the great feast day began to approach, Anna put on her wedding garments and went out to sit in the garden, and she was crying to God, "Why?" And an angel appeared to her. And why we feel that angels could only appear to people in those days is really a misnomer, because they appear to us today if our minds are open to them. I consider communication with the angels, as I said last week, natural as drinking a glass of water. And we will all be that way someday. The angel told Anna that she was going to bear a child. And Anna said, "If I do this, I shall dedicate this child to God." And while she was sitting there in the garden, the angel said, Go now to your husband. Behold, he has had the same vision, and he comes. She went to the gate and saw her husband coming with the sheep, and she fell upon his neck and cried. In their reunion, she became pregnant, and she gave birth later to a daughter called Mary. Now, since Mary had been dedicated to the Temple of Jerusalem, this meant that Anna and Joachim could not keep Mary. As a result, by the time Mary was 3 years old, Joachim came to Anna and said, "Please, Anna, let us take this child and dedicate her to the temple so that before our gift is no longer suitable for God." So they journeyed to the Temple of Jerusalem to dedicate Mary to become a temple virgin. During this time, Anna had a sister named Bianca. Bianca had a daughter named Elizabeth, who was married to Zacharias, and in their union they gave birth to John the Baptist. I'll be with you next week for a continuation into the birth of Jesus the Christ. Thank you, and have a nice week. Thank you for being with us on today's adventure. We are a Christian mystery school under the name of Christian Church of Universal Peace, School of the Mysteries. We know that you may have many questions, and please feel free to call our number at area code 206-362-4134. Area code 206-362-4134. Or join us on our website, mysteryschool.org. That is mysteryschool.org. The God in me bows to the God in you, and may heaven walk with you all week.